All right. Well, I've been excited since you sent your book, Tragedy and Hope 101, The Illusion of Justice, Freedom, and Democracy. And you had sent it right after I took the studio apart I was going out to film on the road. And so I'm glad to have this opportunity to actually discuss the book with you. I hope it's not too late to promote the book because I was really happy when it came in the mail because a lot of people find the 1,300 page version of Tragedy and Hope to be tedious, ominous. Like
A
there's
little intimidating, maybe.
a little intimidating, just a little intimidating. And I think you did a good job of pointing out that much of the Tragedy and Hope by Carol Quigley is put there not so much for the end result of the audience, but to get it through the censorship, with this other 5% of the information. And I think you did a good job of breaking it down such that the everyday, man or woman, who's out there working can understand this very crucial and important part of our history. So how did you come to write this book? Tell me some of the story about the process of understanding that there was this big history book and you thought that maybe something should be out there. And so you took it upon yourself to be creative.
Yeah, it's one of those things. People ask me, why did you want to write the book? And the answer is always, I didn't want to write the book. I don't know if you're familiar with the quote by Orwell. Uh, I'll probably butcher it here, but something along the lines of writing a book is a horrible, exhausting experience. One would never undertake such a thing. Oh no, what is it? It's like a long bout with a painful illness. And that you would never do it unless you were driven by, some demon that you can't control or understand. So, like I said, I probably butchered it, but it's true. I was looking, I've been researching this for over a decade, this ruling elite and how they actually function, and becoming progressively more disturbed with the fact that the vast majority of the population is completely unaware of how the system actually operates. So you just start digging and digging and digging and unearthing more and more information, and a lot of it is buried in what is generally an inaccessible form. So we'll use Tragedy and Hope as a perfect example. For the vast majority of people, that might as well just be inaccessible because they're not going to sit down and read, a 1,300 page, 500,000 plus word history book. They just don't have the time. They can hardly, read a full length article, let alone, that multi-month project, which is, what it would be for most people. So it was just an issue of digging into it and trying to extract a coherent narrative that anybody could understand, and hopefully I succeeded. I did the best I could with it.
I think you did a great job. And before I get into the details of what you covered in the book, I just wanted to mention a couple of the things I noticed at the end of the book, where in reading through the recommended reading, you mentioned War is a Racket by Major General Smedley Butler, The Law by Frederick Bastiat, Dumbing Us Down by John Taylor Gatto, and The Molecular Vision of Life by Lily Kay, in addition to like 25 other books. What do those books all have in common with the Tragedy and Hope 101, your publication?
Well, they all provide a little bit more insight into how the system actually operates. So obviously Smedley Butler is addressing the military instrument and how it's used to maintain the elite's control. What were the other ones you mentioned? Dumbing Us Down, obviously John Taylor Gatto would be the education system. Molecular Vision of Life was another one that you mentioned. That's even scarier. That's eugenics 2.0. Okay, all of this is about controlling human beings. That's the whole point of the entire system. And with the molecular vision of life, you're actually getting into the genetic approach to controlling people on a molecular level. What can we do to get into the epigenetic expression of individuals and manipulate their behavior? Manipulate their behavior, manipulate their beliefs, manipulate their temperament, and control them. So all of these books, depending on what you might be interested in, all provide additional insight into the system itself and really the mindset of the people who control it.
Who do you think your potential audience is? Who's this written towards? Who's it written, to enlighten? Who can pick it up and find it useful?
I think anybody who wants to pick it up and read it will find it useful. And if this doesn't convince you that the political system is all theater, then I don't know that there's really anything. Because that's the thing, this is the culmination of like over a decade's worth of research. So there's I don't even want to guess how many hundreds of books and all of this other stuff. And I eventually settled on this one as being, well, not my book, but Tragedy and Hope, the Anglo-American Establishment, even with the Evolution of Civilizations, and a few others that I sprinkled in there, as providing the most reputable sources to establish this concept of what, where Quigley admits in Tragedy and Hope that the expert will replace the democratic voter in the 20th century. Well, guess what? We're out of the 20th century, and he wrote that back in the 60s. So that this was the goal, that they were creating instruments to do this, to control all habitable portions of the world. And, it's if this doesn't convince you, then you probably don't want to be convinced. And it isn't going to require a tremendous amount of time and effort for you to get through this information. I mean, the book's probably, if you're a slow reader, it might take you 7 hours to get through it, Probably average reader's 5. So it's for anybody who really isn't afraid to face a really ugly truth.
Well, and I noticed that you included more than just Tragedy and Hope. You included references from Quigley's other books. Most importantly, I think Anglo-American Establishment, because, many people say, well, Tragedy and Hope, it doesn't have any footnotes and references. And what most people don't understand is he had access to the records. And then in Anglo-American Establishment, he went in and told you who those people were, where those references are, how to, it's so, but Anglo-American Establishment doesn't really mean a whole lot to a lot of people until they read Tragedy and Hope. And then they're like, okay, what's the next step? And I think Quigley did a good job of laying that out in a much more shorter, condensed, dense book. Like there's a lot in there, but it needs Tragedy and Hope, the big book, to unpack it. And before you can appreciate either of those books, you've got yours, which I consider a guidebook to this treasure that's right in front of us. But a lot of people haven't taken the time to read because it's never been advertised to us.
Yeah, and again, a lot of people I think are just intimidated. They'd be intimidated by the tone, the presentation, the length, all of it. It's not written for the layman. It just isn't, and that's not to say anything about the layman that's negative. They're just not. If you never tied your shoes before, you're not going to be comfortable tying your shoes. Okay, so to just like drop this 5-pound book on someone's desk and say, "Read this, and you'll understand everything." It's just like, come on, man, it's too much. So with this, they get the what I felt, to the best of my ability. You can't really condense 1,300 pages into just a couple hundred pages, but, to the best of my ability, they will get the most important elements of the mindset and the procedures that these people use to further secure and expand their control over everybody while maintaining the illusion that everybody is in control of their own life and they have representative government and they're free and all this other nonsense. And then if people want to dig in deeper, then that's what the footnotes are for. It's like, okay, I want to make sure that this statement right here, did Quigley really say that? Because that is a pretty damning statement. Okay, well, it says it's on Tragedy and Hope page, blah, blah, blah. Yeah. You go there, you read it, and you can read it in the context of what he wrote, and you can see exactly, yes, that's exactly what he said, and yes, it really is that bad. It really is that bad.
Well, going back to your opening statement about writing a book, I think most people think that people write books about what they know, when people who write books know that they actually learn about that topic during the writing of the book, because that's where you really bring everything together, nail it down, tighten it up, and that's where the real knowledge is had. And I think you did a masterful job of taking the meaningful parts, leaving the boring parts aside about diplomacy and all these other things that had gone on. I mean, those are facts in a book, but they're not necessarily relevant to summarizing what the book is. And I think that takes a certain amount of talent to be able to see the big picture and kind of distill it down into everyday language and gather up all these quotes is a diligent effort across the various books and to make sure it's tediously referenced. I think you did a good job at that. What did you learn about Carroll Quigley as a process of learning through writing this book?
Well, I mean, I'd been exposed, I'd heard his name and I'd seen quotes from him prior to getting into Tragedy and Hope. That's what made me purchase Tragedy and Hope to begin with. And, I guess one of the things that I would say I learned about him that I hadn't read elsewhere, or at least an impression that I got, was he wasn't nearly as bad as a lot of people try to make him out to be. I have no doubt that he was an elitist. I have no doubt that he was arrogant. And there are definitely things about him that I would be in disagreement with. But I think there was an element in him of wanting to expose this stuff. Okay, so that right off the bat kind of creates a degree of separation from the people that he's a member of this elite class, this Ivy League historian who's teaching at the School of Foreign Services, Georgetown University in Washington. He's up there teaching the people who are supposedly going to inherit this system of control and use it. And he's seeing things that he disagrees with, and he's saying things that obviously those who controlled it weren't real happy with. So I guess I'd say, you asked the question, what did I learn about him? I guess I always want to kind of go to the source before I make up my mind. So it's not that I had made up my mind that he was this horrible, evil person, but I gained more of a sense of where he was coming from, because I imagine the amount of time and effort he had to put into what he did to expose this information. And at the end of the day, I was just grateful, even though I don't agree. There's a lot about him. He was obviously sucked into it on many levels, being against the radical right, and he got caught up in the divisiveness of it, and he also got caught up in the oh God, what is the word? The intellectual supremacy element of it, where these people know that they're intellectually superior to the average person, so therefore they're drawn to the power and the idea of, well, somebody has to rule, it should be us. All of that was there. But at the same time, I think the more compelling part for me was it was there, but he didn't accept the nefarious nature of what he was stumbling into. So that's a nice long answer to a short, simple question.
Well, I think you hit on several points that I noted there. This intellectual separatism is definitely there, and that's a function of the upper class of society using these universities to create people that would be used to take over their machinations. And one of the people that he trained was Bill Clinton, who went on to be a Rhodes Scholar, even though I don't think he finished his Rhodes Scholarship. What he got was access to that Anglophile network that Quigley was describing. And Quigley, having spent 20 years in their archives and records of the CFR and Royal Institute of International Affairs, I think that he definitely had a perspective that he was from Georgetown. He's, the Georgetown set that was most likely the killers of Kennedy were the people that those were his neighbors. Mm-hmm. And so I think what he got to was, yes, there's something going on in government, but if it's so right, they shouldn't have to keep it secret. And that's why he put those other, the other 5% or 10% in the book that says, look, if these people needed to keep it secret, then they know they're doing something wrong. And that's the moral communication that I think he was trying to get out in the very small part of the big book. And he hit it well amongst boring diplomatic history of these different countries. And it got through. And the proof that maybe he did something that he wasn't authorized to do is in the destruction of the plates. Did you learn anything about that during your process of writing?
Yeah, I mentioned it in the book that he finally realized that they're actually trying to suppress my work. They're telling everybody that they'll print more when there's more orders, but there'll never be any more orders because they're telling everybody who asks that it's out of print and it's not going to be printed anymore. And again, going back to the idea of his position, which I imagine after he saw what they were doing to suppress his work, probably advanced even further in the direction of something that you and I could relate to. He comes right out and says in the Anglo-American establishment and in Tragedy and Hope, look, nobody should have this much power. Nobody. If you value your freedom, this is dangerous. So he was talking, I can't remember which of the two books it was in, but there's a pretty powerful quote where he specifically comes right out and says that. He says, this is too much power to be entrusted to anybody, regardless of how good they are, regardless of how good their intentions are. It's dangerous. So, again, just, a little bit of, I'm grateful that he wrote it. I'll tell you that much, because they're really, if you're looking for a pretty much unimpeachable source of data, there it is. If you really want, I think people are drawn to the stuff they almost like kind of enjoy it. There's the people who want to get their feet wet and they kind of like the conspiratorial nature of it. And they just like to speculate without having any real hard proof or evidence or something that's, very well established and can be confirmed. If you're into that lighter stuff, that's fine. But if you really want to face the reality of what we got going on, here you go. There it is. Take a look at it. And then it kind of, makes the distractions a little less entertaining because you realize how bad it is.
Well, sure. And if you separate the messenger from the message and say, I want to validate what's the validity of this message, you can go to another author, another messenger, if you will, Anthony C. Sutton, who wrote a very similar, but not overlapping, but it's complementary. It fills in all the blanks where Quigley's leaving out. And he also went through a similar persecution after trying to express it and got ejected from the establishment society and had his funding taken away. And so you see this recurring pattern of people understanding, they believe in the system so much that then they find out what's really going on, then they feel compelled to tell people, because there's a whole bunch of other people out there believing in the same thing and losing their choice through that belief in the deception. So let's break it down and define some of these aspects. Who was Quigley defining as this Anglophile network, in your own words?
Well, he starts with the creation of the secret society, which is another thing that he I think did a really great job of imparting, which is the concept of a secret society and the concept of power behind the throne has been around forever. And it's just the way things are. We are led to believe it isn't that way, but that is the way it is. Real power is unelected. Real power is unaccountable. That's why it's real power, because you don't have control over it. It can do what it wants behind the scenes, and if there's a problem, then the puppets get sacrificed or replaced. But its system of control remains intact. Its system of setting policy is there. So he starts, obviously, with Cecil Rhodes founding the secret society, and then I think the most important part of that story is where it all begins. The Royal Institute of International Affairs, the CFR, well, really before that, the inquiry. The inquiry is where it really, in my view, that's where it really truly begins. That's the infiltration of Woodrow Wilson's administration and that whole coup that took place in 1912. And then from there, you get the CFR, and from the CFR, you get the further infiltration of government to the point where, with the War and Peace studies, literally the CFR is basically part of the State Department. Out of that, you get the 1947 National Security Act, and you get the CIA, another fantastic little instrument that they created for their objective. Again, if they can step back and they can realize that all of these things were created by people who had a specific goal, then obviously those things were created with the purpose of achieving that specific goal. So if I want to take over the world, or as Quigley stated, he was quoting Rhodes, to control all habitable portions of the world, then each instrument that I create is going to be created for that purpose. It makes no difference what I say it's created for. Of course, I'm not going to say that's why I'm creating it. I'm going to create, subterfuge, man. I don't want you to understand what's going on. But that's, if it was born of this group, then it was created for that purpose. So that's another really important part of the whole thing, as far as I'm concerned, is that by going back to that beginning starting point and then following the story, you become aware that the whole mantra of the CIA being about protecting us, or the NSA, or any of this other stuff, who created it? Do they respect our freedom? No, they don't at all. They resent it. They want to undermine it. They want complete control. So that, I'm not saying there aren't wonderful people in the CIA, and I'm not saying that there aren't wonderful people in the NSA. What I'm saying is, there is meaningless. It would be like saying the government must not be corrupt because Ron Paul was in it. Okay? Yeah, Ron Paul, or the CFR can't be that powerful because Angelina Jolie is in it. It's irrelevant. It's ridiculous. Angelina Jolie, the War and Peace studies where the CFR was basically running the State Department, only a tiny handful of the CFR members at that time were even aware of that. So even in that case, even with something as big as that, it was only a select handful of the real power structure within the CFR that was involved in it. So people just kind of need to try to step back and understand all that. I think and once they do that, I think it starts to become, the picture, or the intellectual framework for the picture starts to emerge, and you can start to put it together.
One, I think G. Edward Griffin did a good job of that in the forward and the introduction, and he's spoken in the past about these rings within rings. So really, only the power center of the CFR has anything to do with anything, and those other pieces, some of those people were there just to pay dues and get membership, and some of the people are there for advertising and PR reasons. It's the same reason Angelina Jolie is held up as a trophy by the United Nations and all that sort of stuff. They're just seeking to subvert individuals through that public relations persona.
They need somebody that people can relate to too. So everybody knows Angelina Jolie. Hey man, that's cool. She's doing, the average versus these sociopaths that are actually running things.
Well, and what they're doing is propagandizing, and how you know it's propaganda is because it's not educating people to be free. It's actually dumbing them down so that they're not free, and that they buy into these collectivist organizations, whether it's the UN or the overall globalist concept. So let's go back to the late 1800s. You had Andrew Carnegie, who's part of the British Empire. He's a big steel magnate from around Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, but he's from Scotland, but he's living in America. He writes Triumphant Democracy in 1893, basically calling for the globalization of America and its resources. And then you've got Cecil Rhodes, who's carrying forth a British Freemasonry idea of bringing America back into the British colonies. And he writes that last will and testament in 1902, or he dies in 1902. It goes into action. The people who had funded him and De Beers were the Rothschild banking family. So when we get to, a couple segments to the Federal Reserve and talk about power and using money, we can talk about that. But there's all these overlapping connections between the industrialists and the robber barons who were globalists, and then forthcoming working groups in the 20th century, each of which had diminishing membership. So the CFR comes, it has like 5,000 members. Then you had Bilderberg, and there's so many, maybe 1,000 members. Then there's Trilateral Commission, and then there, fewer members. So it's like step by step, just like you said. If they had a goal to do something, then all those instruments that follow that are pertaining to that are also going toward that goal. And that's what most people don't realize today, because it has such an overwhelming grasp on our sense of constitutional republic right now in this country.
The Federal Reserve System is there to keep our monetary system stable. The income tax is there to help the government pay for things that you need. Sound familiar? You might have learned that somewhere. No, they didn't create those instruments for those purposes.
Do you remember anything about Milner's Kindergarten, the kind of working roundtable group that took over as soon as Cecil Rhodes kicked the bucket?
Well, yeah, I mean, he became the top guy within the primary ring. And these were his, I don't know, what would be the word? His apprentices? I don't know. What's the correct word for it? To
Acolytes.
Be spread out throughout
Stooges.
The world. To go take care of the business that needed to be taken care of, and then Oxford, of course, where they're the recruiting ground. If the Ivy League is where they recruit from here for the CIA and other top powerful positions, then I guess you would say Oxford would be the equivalent of the Ivy League over there.
Well, and I think all the Ivy League schools are made in the image of Oxford, and that Oxford, being around for the past 1,000 years, definitely has been an instrument of the empire and the monopolization of the heroin and opium trade during the East India Company days. And reading a book that's called Cloak and Gown by Robin Winks. It's all about how MI6 and now the CIA use the universities as a seeding ground for intelligence, and the professors that are there recruiting students and that sort of thing. It's also a pretty thick book, might be 800 pages, but for people who are interested in how universities and empire tie together, it's a pretty interesting read. There's also I think it's called Universities and Empire by Sigmund Diamond, that's published by Oxford. And so when you get a better grasp after, someone reads Tragedy and Hope 101 and they think, instead of reading the big book, let's continue learning about the general area. Well, you can find out that, the Rockefeller empire, if you will, not only, had these adverse effects on the school system in this country and the medical schooling system, but they also, through the foundation, acted as a front for intelligence. The intelligence agencies act as fronts for these robber barons.
Absolutely. That's what they were created for. They created them. Okay, so there you go. Again, we go back to the inquiry. We go to go to Alan Dulles, right there, one of the supreme scumbags, and pardon my French, but I mean, this guy, if you want somebody who thinks he can literally just do whatever he wants, including kill and rape, murder, pillage, whatever it is, to achieve the aims, he's right there instrumental in creating the CIA. You know, so and then you were talking about the universities and the role that they play. You can just imagine with all of the data that they're gathering from people as they're working their way through there, the psychological profiles that they could be building on these highly intelligent, capable people, and they can pick out the ones for different areas. You can imagine how powerful that is, where they ask all these questions and just what they know about human behavior and psychology and all this other stuff. That as these people are working their way through these Ivy League schools, now this is definitely a candidate for this particular position. This is somebody who, so Alan Dulles obviously demonstrated the disposition of an individual who would be useful within that system. Not only creating the CIA, but then running it for such a long time and using it as an instrument to destroy national sovereignty.
Well, and before Alan Dulles and John Foster Dulles came along and took over the intelligence apparatus and the State Department, and then were around when Kennedy got killed, and then Alan Dulles gets in charge of the Warren Commission. Before all of that, we had this guy, Colonel House, who was basically a pre-Dulles. He was an Anglophile working toward the same aims of dissolving America's sovereignty. And I'm not saying that I believe in nation states. I believe in individuals being free and not aggressing on other people. And we just happen to be born into this system where at this point in the history of the evolutionary history of nation states, we're at this point where they want to do globalism, which might be a great idea, but not if it's done under a whole theme of tyranny. And the people who have been bringing us tyranny and democide for the past 100 years should not be the leaders of any global organization, for the simple fact that once you lose local accountability, you lose freedom.
Look, we can't control them now. We, meaning United States citizens, have no control, no reasonable measure of control over what the federal government is doing. I mean, I don't think anybody would argue with that. What happens when it just becomes completely supranational and nameless, faceless, completely global? Of course, again, they're going to try to maintain the illusion of this being by the consent of the governed, and all the little nations have a voice in it, and the people of those little nations have a voice in it, but it's a lie. It's just a ruse. It's a joke. And you can just determine that by looking at the actual policies that get enacted. Like, look at the banker bailouts. That's a perfect example where you literally have 98% of the adult population saying, no, we do not want it. But you have a handful, probably less than 50 people in the power centers that do want it. And, maybe a circle of people around them that are a little bit larger. But, who was really in control of setting that policy, of pushing that through? Those are the people who have the real power. Now, of course, they don't like it when they have to show their hand like that. But rest assured, when it comes to any of these people that they're parading around now for the presidency, there are certain things that just aren't going to be touched. And those are the things that are most important to those seeking to control everything.
Well, and Princeton recently had that study where they said America is an oligarchy, not a constitutional republic, because rich people are in control. And that just made me think of this Princeton graduate from back in the day. They have this place there now called the Woodrow Wilson, blah, blah, blah. But Woodrow Wilson was he was a president of Princeton, if I recall, before he was president of the United States. And you described that as the coup of 1912 in your book. Could you talk a little bit about Woodrow Wilson and how he brought the, Federal Reserve in, and World War I and these sorts of things that were dynamic in the globalists' agenda to move America out of its attitudes, values, and behaviors and beliefs?
Well, maybe we should go back one step prior.
Sure.
And go to the Carnegie Foundation, stating with Catherine Casey, where it gets into that a little bit, Catherine Casey and Norman Dodd, what they uncovered, which was prior to, a few years prior to that, where they are actually convening and speaking about how they need to get the United States involved in a major war, because war is the best way to disrupt a current system. So, well, it wasn't just they wanted to pull the United States in so that they would have that advantage there, but then of course it's a way of remaking the world. How many empires were lost in World War I? It was the Russian Empire fell, the Ottoman Empire fell shortly after, the German Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire. So there's a real benefit here to get this. So they're in there, the Carnegie Foundation. And this is what the poor woman lost her mind over, because she thought, the nonprofit the nonprofit organizations, you can't, though they do so much good, they couldn't possibly be involved in something nefarious as facilitating carnage and war just so they could get what they wanted. Okay, but they're discussing specifically how they have to, they basically have to take over the policy-making apparatus of the United States of America, specifically the State Department and anything dealing with, foreign affairs. And so you get that as the pretext. Now, what are some of the things that we want or will need in order to dominate the government of the United States? And this is another little tidbit that comes from Quigley, which is they created the central banks to dominate the nation states by controlling treasury loans and interest rates and exchange rates, and of course greasing the skids of compliant congressmen. So this is why they wanted that instrument, and they needed somebody to really take control of the United States. It wasn't just a matter of the inquiry, which was very useful, that got in there and was able to start pulling strings. And Mandelhouse, who was probably just an intelligence agent, who was Woodrow Wilson's handler, whether he realized it or not. Okay, it went beyond that. It went into the creation of these instruments, the income tax and the central bank. And at the time, Taft, who was heavily favored to win by a long margin, wasn't ready to hand over the power of our nation's currency creation to international bankers, which is essentially what the Federal Reserve System is. So they needed to get somebody else in there. So they pulled out their old hat trick of dividing the vote, and that's how they got Woodrow Wilson in there, who was perfectly okay with it.
Well, and Taft was one of their guys. I mean, Taft, he's the son of the guy who founded Skull and Bones. So it's not like he's not Eastern establishment, right. And he's, but I think they just wanted to go a little bit further than even someone like him wanted to, because the Internationalists, they had a much bigger plan than somebody who grew up with some sort of pride and freedom. Pride in being able to be self-reliant that brings on that self-confidence and, these sorts of ideas that were foreign still to the British Empire at that time.
Yeah, well, yeah, again, I covered that briefly in the book, that it isn't like Taft was great. He just wasn't quite he just didn't have all of it. Whereas Woodrow Wilson, with his Messiah complex and him feeling like there should be a federation of empires, which he was writing about as early as the late 1800s. This was his idea.
Yeah.
So again, here you're in control of the universities. You see the path of these individuals. You're giving them personality tests and all the stuff that they do in school. And so you see, like, who are you going to pick if you want to sell a new world order? You're going to pick somebody who passionately believes in it and might actually think it's his idea. So he'll go out and he'll evangelize for it, whereas these people never could get away with it.
Well, and I think there's another pattern there, because what Rhodes did was simply subscribe to an already existing British Freemasonic idea and give it some specificity and some funding from outside, because I'm not sure that the Rothschilds were part of British Freemasonry. That's all kind of nebulous, connections. So I don't like to make them. But the Rothschilds are involved with Rhodes. Rhodes is a Freemason. Kipling's a Freemason. They had already adopted this idea of dominance over the English-speaking peoples of the world, to use them to control every other part of the world. So it's like a multi-layered plan for dominance. And Rhodes comes along. He has some specificity to it, whereas Carnegie's plan was just generalized. He's like, this should be done. Rhodes is like, not only should it be done, but here's some funding. Here's a secret society. Here's a bunch of scholars to go and permeate the statecraft culture of other nations, because there was a lot of Rhodes scholars that were in Germany before World War I and World War II. There were a few years where they didn't allow them in there, but as far as British intelligence goes, Rhodes scholars in Britain had already undermined the entire intelligence apparatus of Germany. And when you look into how did they do that, I'm like, oh, they had a bunch of people who are already trained in their culture and loyal to the bigger plan. And that seems to be how a lot of that unfolded. The other thing that you were saying about the central banks was what comes later in the 20th century is more abstractions from central banks, like the IMF, the World Bank, International Monetary Fund. Yeah. What's the other one? The clearinghouse. There's
International Settlements.
Yeah, the BIS. And so let's just go back to 1913. And why did they want to take over the money apparatus? What does that allow them to do specifically in this country?
All right. Well, I mean, the money is the oxygen for the lungs of the beast. I mean, seriously, if you look at any, how do empires collapse? They run out of money, you know? So if you can create literally a limitless amount of money out of nothing and convince everybody else to use it, the power is, it's like, it's self-evident, but it really isn't. You have to really think about it. Like, what if today I gave Richard Grove the exclusive ability to create our nation's money supply and create as much as he saw fit? And not only does he get to create it, but he gets to create inescapable debt by only loaning it into existence, because that's just a whole other element of power there, because the hand of the lender is above the hand of the borrower. I mean, that's an old axiom. So it creates, it's really hard to define how enormous it is, to try to boil down how much power that is. If you can just create money out of thin air and limitless amounts of it, and create limitless amount of debt, and the servitude and dependency that is born of that is pretty much, I think if we could cut off the funding, if we could cut off the funding, I say that as like if it were easy. If it were easy for us to cut off the funding, what would happen to their system? All these people that serve this system serve it because they're being paid. The vast, vast majority of the bureaucracy, the vast, vast majority of the military, the vast majority of every single element and instrument has people that are there for a paycheck. If those paychecks disappeared, they're not going to show up. So if you look at it from that perspective, money as a weapon, you take that weapon away, and I think that's really their Achilles heel. It's not that that's an easy thing to do, but they didn't create it for no reason. They created that power, and we can see the result of it. We can see the result of just like one of the ways that they use it would be, for instance, funding. So if you want to create dependency, right? You're loaning all this money, but you're not really loaning it. You're creating it out of nothing. It just has the illusion of as if this is something that you earned and you own and you created some wealth somewhere. It isn't that, but nobody else knows that, so that's okay. So then you elect well-meaning politicians, or maybe not so well-meaning politicians. It doesn't make any difference. All that matters is whatever they are, they want to increase spending. They want to create new mouths. Like if you look at a new program as a mouth to feed, some really, really expensive new mouth to feed that the government doesn't have enough money for. You loan them the money to create that mouth, and then you create this mouth never goes away. It only gets bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. So then you're just, the people who created it and the people who control it and the people who benefit from that mouth in their own little world will protect it, and it creates an insatiable need for more and more loans. Never mind the interest on everything that starts to, eat away at everything. So
then you get increased taxation with that. You get,
of course,
yeah.
It's just like it's a tornado of death. It just starts the death spiral of debt, where it just gets bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger, and then everything that has been created as a result of that money that was created out of nothing becomes more and more insatiable, until eventually the people who control that one primary asset that is necessary for all of it to continue to exist, and is necessary for all of the people who benefit from it to exist, they have leverage that is beyond anything else, because that's the shared interest of it all, regardless of somebody's political leanings or their ideological beliefs or anything like that. If they're a part of this system and they're benefiting from it, and it's their kids' college fund and it's their vacation home and everything else, they're going to want to protect that. That's where they're going to come together and say, okay, well, I might, there's some infighting and stuff like that, but all these other little players and all the other people in the administrative bureaucracy of everything, they all agree with one thing. Boy, we don't want the government to shut down. Can't have that.
Well, and I think a lot of this stays off people's radar until...
Again,
there's a little delay. We're having a little bit of technical, but it's not too bad. It's very listenable thus far. Yeah, it just breaks up every now and then. I've been able to understand everything you're saying, but I think it stays off people's radar until they get, to page like 51 or 52, not far into Tragedy and Hope, when he's like, hey, the Rothschilds, they're bankers, they've been controlling stuff for a while. And, the Bank of England existed well before the Federal Reserve System of this country, but they're not so far different, and they're not necessarily owned by different entities. And the outsourcing of the production of currency in this country was a valuable resource that we had and we owned ourselves. And it's like, once you outsource it to these people who have been notorious in funding both sides of war for centuries, I just think the fact that they keep it off our radar means that if it was on people's radar, they would be more likely to resist the whole banking system and notice it for what it is. But the withholding of that select piece of information, that there's a layering of these ruling families that are a type of aristocracy above all the industries because they actually create money out of nothing. And that's just left off of our map that they give us through schooling. I think that fact that it's left off the map says it's essential to know about for freedom.
Of course, yes. I mean, when you think of money, you think, I have to go earn money, or I have to borrow money, or I have to steal money. Those are your options. That's all people think of when they think of money. Good people think, I have to earn money. I have to provide some product or service so I can earn money. Other people that can be good say, okay, well, I need to do something. I might have to borrow money from somebody. And then thieves would say, I can steal it. But nobody ever says, what if I could just create it? What if I can just create money? What if I can just print it? Okay, I need $1 million. You need $1 million. Imagine how much good you could do with $1 million. Just go ahead and write yourself $1 million check and put it in the bank and start hiring your army of tragedyandhope.com warriors to go out and spread the gospel of how the world actually operates. You could probably get a lot done. Now realize how insignificant $1 million is to these people. We're not talking millions, man. We're talking all of the money, all of it, all of it. They own all of it. They created all of it.
And below that creation of the bankers, they have this political work group, think tanky type system. So what's the relationship between the Royal Institute of International Affairs and this thing in this country we call the Council on Foreign Relations?
Well, this was, again, they were the initial creations, I guess you would say, of roads, the initial primary instruments that then led to all the rest of them. So the Royal Institute of International Affairs would be dealing with Europe, obviously, and the CFR would be the United States. I haven't researched the Royal Institute of International Affairs much, other than knowing what it is. It was just the other arm. It was the European arm of what they were creating, the primary European arm. I guess they created a bunch of similar institutes. But the big ones were the Royal Institute and the CFR.
And the CFR publishes this journal called Foreign Affairs, and Foreign Affairs originally was called the Journal of Race Relations. And so the whole idea of international relations as it's known today was created out of this fine, I always say it's a finite planet. There's only so many people that are trying to use science, technology, and money to control the rest of us. The people that happen to do that, they're also into eugenics. They're also into population control and these other notions. And they fostered Rhodes's apartheid in South Africa. Rhodes and Chaim Weissman and a couple other people that were involved in creating Israel had traded letters on, hey, what a great way to run a country, and we want to create what you've done down there over here in Palestine. And so even on seemingly opposing sides, you see the sharing of these strategies among the globalists. And whether it's globalism or communism or any of these other isms, what you see is people who are willing to go far beyond the bounds of freedom in order to pillage and plunder the rights and property of other people. And that's a fundamental issue that reflects through all of human history, but this is a particularly interesting part because we're living through it.
Well, it's always been that way. There have always been rulers. For as long as there have been people to rule, there have been people who ruled them. And there is a certain defining characteristic of people who are drawn to those positions of power. They have to possess it. It's like, you're never going to be the heavyweight UFC champion if you're afraid to get hit in the face or you don't want to hit people. You're just not going to go there. It's not going to happen. And the same is true for people who are interested in dominating others. There's a personality disorder, shall we call it? Whatever it is, it exists and it's real, and you have to be that type of person. Can you imagine? Like, I love animals. Animals and music are like, they both really bring a lot of joy to my life. Can you imagine somebody who enjoys torturing an animal? Like, can you imagine like enjoying taking a puppy and doing, I'm not even gonna get into it because it's disgusting. But like there was that woman who was torturing animals and she YouTubed herself, and I think she finally got busted for it. But anyway, the point being, most people cannot imagine that. Most people love animals, and even if they don't love animals, they can't imagine deriving joy and satisfaction from torturing something to death. Okay? But those people exist. Okay? They exist, and we know they exist because there's evidence of it. All right. That's a mindset that's hard for people to imagine. The same is true for them to imagine that their leaders, the people who are at the top of the pyramid, are they lack the concept of a moral dimension. Okay, they don't believe in the concept of a moral dimension. There is no moral dimension. All that matters, there is only one law, the law of power. Do you have the ability to do what you want to do, or do you not? If hiding behind morality enables you to do what you want to do, then you hide behind morality. Hiding behind democracy, hiding behind religion, hiding behind whatever it is, whatever pretext you need to offer in order to get it. Up to and including, okay, I want to invade this country. So I need to justify my presence in the Middle East. Oh, okay, so how about we fund and train and arm the Islamic State? That would be fantastic, because now we create this horrible new replacement for Al-Qaeda, which we also created, and they're going to create chaos, and somebody has to do something about this Islamic State, and we can use it as a justification for our continued, this was a Department of Defense document that was recently released, where they said they knew it would lead to the rise of an Islamic State in eastern Syria and the problems that are being encountered in Iraq, but that's okay because it'll serve our purposes. They didn't say it'll be okay, but they understood that that's what would happen, and that that's what the Allied powers thought would be useful, because then it gives us a pretext for what we're doing. So not only a pretext there, not only a pretext to be continually involved there, which is what they've wanted since, the PNAC document. I'm sure you're familiar with that, pre 9/11, stating that, the issue of why we're in the Middle East transcends Saddam Hussein. It has nothing, we're using the no-fly zone as an excuse right now, but it transcends that. We want to be there. We need to be there. We need to control that region. Okay, so then they create this, they fund them, they train them, they arm them, they protect them, they protect their supply lines, the oil, everything else, and then they get two things out of it. Why wouldn't they do it? They get to justify their ongoing intervention there. They put pressure on the Syrian regime, Assad, and then they also they have a new boogeyman that they can terrify all the American people with, the horrible ISIS terrorists, to justify the further erosion of freedom here in the United States. So it's just a nice, big, perfect, wonderful system. So why wouldn't they do it? Most people, just like the people who can't imagine why would you torture an animal, they do it because it gives them what they want. That's why they do it. It's no more complicated than that.
Well, and you can see it through not only current history, but that's why they funded Hitler. That's why Western technology built the Soviet Union and created the Cold War dynamic, because it allows them to do these unconscionable things that they can never do during peacetime, but they have to do it because the Nazis are doing it. They have to do it because the Soviets or the Chinese are doing it, and then they do all sorts of awful things to people. And they also, like, the Milner Group they set up the breaking of the League of Nations treaties, after 1919 Versailles, to put Germany in a position where they would do exactly what they wanted them to do, which was industrialize, arm themselves, and then get aggressive and try to take back what was taken away in 1919. And because the people doing it to those countries were masters of the PR dynamic, where they were doing public relations and trying to do propaganda, not education, they were able to dehumanize the entire German population through a series of ad campaigns, again, because they had done it in World War I successfully. So I just see they continue to do the same thing, and it's about catching on to that pattern. and hopefully getting other people to understand that what they're seeing out there as far as today with ISIS, yeah, that goes back to Al Qaeda and Western funding of Al Qaeda and the Mujahideen, goes back to Western funding of the Muslim Brotherhood, and it goes back to a multi-hundred-year pattern of the British Empire employing proxy forces to do their dirty work so that they can have plausible deniability, and the Americans, the CIA, etc., have just adopted those techniques because they still work until people smarten up.
Well, of course. I mean, again, if you figure that this Anglo-American establishment came from Europe, right? And it's coming in. It's of course going to be structured the same way.
Well, and it also has a longer history than a lot of people think of. It goes back to 1066 and William the Conqueror, and then you can go forward. But you have World War I is a fight between Queen Victoria's grandchildren, basically. And it's the conversion of this very upfront royal monarchy style of rule to the implementation of these proxy governments, where now, because I think after the French Revolution, they started to look at their system and say, wait a minute, what if we were ruling more indirectly so people couldn't just take us to the guillotine? And then you see this idea of nation states pop up, and Germany and these other countries, but they still had, a monarchy or a royal family. Well, if you look up the German royal family from World War I, they're still around today. The House of Hohenzollern and their titles, their princely, titles and this sort of stuff. So this class system still exists throughout all of Europe, basically. It's just taken off the radar, and now people talk about Angela Merkel in Germany as if she's like the person running the country. But I think there's also a behind-the-scenes divine right of kings element to this whole apparatus that still exists in many forms.
They've never known anything else. So that's another thing. These people, that they're born into a position of privilege where, of course, you use other people's blood to get what you want. Of course, you use other people's money. Of course, it's just as much as you can take. That's what the game is. That's the game of controlling as much geography and as many people as you possibly can. That's how it works. So to them, it's the idea of not having access to that is as foreign to them as the idea would be for us to have access to that. You could imagine, again, if you could just start conscripting people and forcing them to give you their money. Like if I could just, let's use propaganda as an example. I'm getting hot, man. I'm taking my coat off, my sweat jacket. Let's imagine the education system, which is you got into, you got Carnegie and you got Rockefeller, both kind of getting involved in that to try to shape minds according to their will so it would serve their interests. What if we had the power to do that? What if I, just from a selfish standpoint, had the power to make my book mandatory reading in 10th grade? All right? Probably have a pretty significant impact if I could reach every single 10th grader. Not only that, I'd get some money out of the deal because, of course, since it was the government buying it, the government money that they've stolen from other people, I could charge $30 a book for it, and I'd sell millions of copies, and everything would be great. Even if I was just a greedy person, I would have an incentive to try to ingratiate myself into that system. But if I wasn't, how about we just look at it from the perspective of we want to help affect the way people see things? How much of an impact would that have? Can you imagine if you would have read Tragedy and Hope 101 in 10th grade? It would have been like a big deal.
Yeah.
You might have been reading something that was like, wow, this is history that's kind of makes sense, and this is something maybe I should care about.
And you can dig into it.
Yeah. There's some context about how Hitler came to power. Not just that he was when it happened and who he was, but how he came into power and who was behind it and what the purposes was and how awful that horrible tragedy was, and that the people who orchestrated the entire thing never paid for it.
Right.
They profited from it. They got what they wanted out of it.
Well, and even all the people that helped to protect it, like Allen Dulles, all they did was secure power for the people that already held power. Like, Allen Dulles was doing it to cover up the Rockefeller, Standard Oil, all the investments that they had in Germany. So you have this point where what they do and what we say as a country, as individuals, voting together or some idea like that, there's no causal connection. And again, that's what the Princeton study was saying. There's no causal action of connectivity between what people want and what the government's actually doing. And that proves in and of itself that they're derelict. They're not there to serve make us. First off, they're not supposed to make us safe. They're supposed to protect our rights. They're not doing that. They're using all the tax dollars they extort to spy on people, to take away your various levels through the Bill of Rights. They're trying to soften that all up for taking it away in straight up executive orders or constitutional amendments. And this is what Carnegie Institute for Advanced, what was it? Carnegie Institute for Peace back in the early 1900s. Yeah, this is what they said they wanted to do. So they had a prescription. They've gone about doing it in the past 100 years. We're now finding out about it. We're making media to try to let people know. It's like, hey, there's this plan. It's well funded. It's been in progress. And they're almost at the end of it. And the end of it means we all lose our freedom basically forever, because it took a long time for any type of freedom to emerge on this planet where at least you had the potential to be more free. In Europe, people, all the property was already bought up. All the class system was already there. That's, if you're born into that situation, it's like a caste system. Whereas people in America, there seemed for a while to be more opportunity until the industrialists and the bankers really, clamped down on it and started extracting our wealth and making us more ignorant during that process. I noticed that there was a couple things in your book that weren't in Tragedy and Hope because they happened outside of Quigley's purview. Mm-hmm. But you wrote about Operation Gladio, which was a joint NATO operation between the American and British and a couple other countries that went on from 1946 basically to present. Could you describe that in your own words?
Well, Operation Gladio is I felt it tied into Quigley's where Quigley was revealing the way governments operate, and they engage in dual policies, and they even engage in false flag terrorism in order to achieve their objectives. Quigley highlights some of that stuff, which is, again, really useful, because to a lot of people, they hear false flag and conspiracy theory, they throw their arms up and conveniently don't have to think. But Quigley speaks specifically of Hitler using it, and I think Operation Himmler is one of the things that he gets into, burning of the Reichstag. So after having that established, now we can start getting into, so we have this established by Quigley. False flags are real. Governments use it. They benefit from it. They use it because it works. How else might we see this group of individuals who, by the way, empowered Hitler every step of the way and helped him get into power and probably told him how great burning the Reichstag would work? Let's take that same general concept and look at these people, the CIA specifically, CIA, creation of the CFR, creation of the Inquiry, creation of, working our way backward, creation of the Rhodes Secret Society, how they used Operation Gladio to hide weapons and fund terrorists and use the carnage of those terrorist attacks to blame people who did not do them, were not involved in it. So obviously they hide their own hand in it. And then in addition to that, they pick the patsy that they want to blame for it so they can further their objectives, which in this case, they used the argument that they were trying to prevent the spread of communism in Europe. But why? Well, because we're trying to preserve democracy. You're doing everything you can to undermine democracy and democratic practices. So what is the real purpose here? And so in the book, I give my take on that, which is it was just an extension of the sovereignty destruction project. That's what this is. There's always going to be a pretext, but what is the ultimate aim? The ultimate aim, what is the result? A further consolidation of power and control, further destruction of the individual people's ability to determine their own destiny, their own political destiny, their freedom to take that from them. So how many, I don't know if you've read Ganser's book, but, it's a pretty disturbing book. It isn't very long. It's pretty disturbing and gets into these I use the word people lightly, that were recruited. Alan Dulles had no problem with using Nazis or anybody else, regardless of how heinous the crimes, to do this. And obviously, again, if you're willing to blow up innocent people and then wave the bloody shirt to get the response from everybody so you can get what you want, it should be self-evident that you're going to have no problem working with the lowest of the low that you can find on the earth. And that maybe, if we could just get people to understand that concept, how horribly backward it is that they look at their leaders and the leaders are exalted as if they're some, as if they're morally superior to everybody. They are morally inferior to almost everybody. Sure, there might be a couple who are lower, but man, they're probably long dead or in prison by now. They're really at the as far as being immoral goes, they have to be at the top of the heap because they're willing to do whatever it takes.
Yeah, I think for people to understand like JFK's assassination and the Warren Commission, all you need to do is understand who Allen Dulles is, what is his morality and character and history relative to that situation. Well, he was fired by JFK for a reason. We might not know what that reason is. There's a lot of speculations, but we know that Dulles brought in Nazis through paperclip. He was running MK Ultra. He was running Operation Mockingbird. He was running all the necessary operations and overthrowing all these countries between 1953 and Kennedy's assassination, that they had already created a cookie cutter template for how to handle the press, how to handle witnesses, how to do all that stuff, and how to run a cover up. And then they just came home. The chickens came home to roost, and it's a tragic situation, but I'm surprised that no one cried bloody murder when Dulles is in charge of the investigation. It would have been like having Kissinger and his whole situation in charge of 9/11 Commission. I mean, you got a guy who tried. Yeah, I mean, Kissinger Associates is a plausible inheritor of the British East India Company's drug monopoly network. And so when you look into the overlap of Kissinger Associates and 9/11, you've got L. Paul Bremer. He's an ex-Kissinger associate. You've got Brent Scowcroft, who's on the E-4B, waiting to take off when the first tower blows up. So there's a bunch of people within Kissinger Associates that had some ominous placement on that day in their activities going forward, because they're all in the same small circle of power. And when you see what's behind that circle, oh, it's the people who funded the Nazis. It's the people who funded the Soviets. It's the people who funded communist China and taking away of their guns to kill hundreds of millions of people during the 20th century.
All of that, like just the idea that you have, again, the mindset, the person who will torture animals and enjoys it. The mindset, the person who will set into motion something that they know will lead to carnage, but they're satisfied because it achieves what they wanted. Okay, so just like the idea, like if right now you were in a position where you were given the ability to determine something. How's my connectivity over there?
That's
You're
good.
Breaking up a little bit on my end. Can you hear me?
Yeah, okay. I can still hear you.
The screen is pixelating a little. But anyway, if you were given that power to where, like, let's say, for instance, overthrowing the Guatemalan government, like they did in 1954 after their success in 1953 with Mossadegh.
That was Operation PB Success you're talking about? Okay.
Yes. PB Success. And just the hundreds of thousands of people who were slaughtered as a result of that. And yet they're cheering and they're toasting because it's what they wanted. Hey, look, we did it again, boys. We were able to completely overthrow this legitimate government and install a government that was friendly, in this case, to the interests of United Fruit. Okay. And we got it. So cool. We're never even crossing their minds of how many people died and suffered and were destroyed by it. And going back to where it all started, where you were talking about Operation Gladio in Northwoods. Northwoods, again, is just another example, another excellent example where people need to read this stuff. Northwoods especially, because it's so short and so simple, and you can get it at the National Security Archive online, George Washington University. You can read it in their own words where they're conspiring to create a situation where they take a plane, load it with fake passengers, convert it into a remote-controlled drone, fly it over a given area, and then detonate it with a bomb. It sounds like some crazy conspiracy theory that only an idiot would think of. This is an official U.S. government document that they wrote back in the 60s.
Signed by the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Lyman Lemnitzer.
Right, who eventually went over to work in Europe as the Supreme Allied Commander of NATO, which is where Operation Gladio was taking place. So people say, one of the arguments that people will bring up is, oh yeah, Lemnitzer signed off on it, but he was fired for it. He wasn't punished, he was promoted. Here is this guy that says, look, we can use false flag terror tactics to manipulate the United States citizens to get what we want. In this case, it was to create a pretext to attack Cuba. Somebody in the higher ups, I imagine, looked at that document and said, okay, well, you know what? He's not going to work in this given area, but let's stick him over here in NATO, where we've got this other operation going on, Operation Gladio, where it's perfectly okay to do these things, and he'll probably be a real asset there. Because can you imagine, like, if you or I conspired to carry out terrorist attacks against the, I mean, because the thing with the airplane was just one of many recommendations. There were actual, they were actually going to kill people and blame Cuban terrorists of doing it. Can you imagine if you or I conspired to do that? That maybe we would get something more than fired from our job and then given another job somewhere else, which was effectively a promotion.
Well, it would be detrimental unless you work for the Rand Corporation, in which case it's your job to do that sort of stuff. I was just looking through recently those the DC strategic trends documents that the Ministry of Defense in the UK puts out, and it's like a plan for the future. So there's a document, it's from 2007 to 2035, and now there's a newer one that goes out to 2040. And basically, when you're reading through their plans for the future as globalists, you know, heightened social tensions in America, rioting, terrorist attacks by, you know, something like ISIS, these sort of things are in these plans. So you can go back and read the 2007 plan. You'll see they've already done a whole bunch of this stuff. It talks about brain chip implementation, the use of cybernetics to control individuals, new forms of warfare. They're pretty interesting documents, but what they're showing is that they're taking their information from the Rand Corporation. So this corporation that's in America that's doing these nefarious plans for the past 60 years, and you know their papers, the Pentagon Papers came from Rand. So that was like their planning and implementation of the Vietnam War. This think tank is shared not just in America defense. British Ministry of Defense is running their projections from this American think tank, which again goes back to show the close connectivity of the Anglo-American establishment in this globalist plan. The other thing that I saw on my desk here is I'd ripped this out of a Vanity Fair article recently. Let's see. It's Holiday 2015-2016, and it's from page 73. And it's Vanity Fair nominates the Carnegie medalists. So these are people of the Carnegie Institute. They're getting medals. And it talks about how Carnegie was this great philanthropist and he built thousands of libraries in the United States and with funding with J.P. Morgan and blah, blah, blah. But over here, one of the guys getting a medal, I just couldn't get over the irony, is a co-founder of something called the Carlyle Group. His name's David Rubenstein. So when you look at 100 years ago, the Carnegie Institute and what it's doing today, it's popularizing the ideas being purveyed by these other people who uphold their plan. The other item I'd bring to bear, since you were bringing Operation Northwoods out, there's a Defense Intelligence Agency FOIA request. And this guy from DIA, Defense Intelligence Agency, issued a complaint to the Department of Defense Inspector General. And basically, in his report, he points out that in the summer of 2000, they had this briefing called the Weapons of Mass Destruction and Threat to the United States. And in there, it says the oral briefing itself was sensitive. So this is a year before 9/11. It identifies World Trade Center 1 and 2 as the most likely buildings to be attacked in the United States, closely followed by the Pentagon. The briefer indicated the worst case scenario would be one tower collapsed onto the other. The possibility of striking the buildings with a plane may have been discussed then. It was certainly discussed in the red cell analysis leading up to the briefing. It then goes on to talk about how the building could be struck by an airliner. And so they've got an almost verbatim discussion about the terrorist attack that happens a year later that comes out as a result of this FOIA request. So it's really showing a smoking gun, very much like the Northwoods document, that they had these hints that terror was going to happen, and then they just happened to make it very custom, tailor-made, so it fit their needs precisely at the right time to coincide with business plans and these other strategies that they had in place. So I think that only looking through these actual documents, these pieces of evidence, like you said, Operation Gladio, there's a lot of information out there. Ganser's book is probably the best reference on it. And Operation Northwoods, which is a very interesting document you can read in a PDF out there. These are facts of American history, which
even Operation Ajax, PB Success, I don't know what the name was for what they did in Chile with Pinochet, all of these provide, and all of the other, El Salvador, all the other governments that they've been involved in messing with, all provide insight into the mindset of these people. It's their mindset that you really have to understand. Of course they would do it. Why wouldn't they? Why wouldn't they? It seems like a simple statement. Why wouldn't they? You would say, or the average person would say, well, because it's wrong. Or, I mean, if you know how they think, you realize how ridiculous that sounds. Why wouldn't they do it? The only thing that would prevent them from doing it would be if they thought they couldn't get away with it. Now go read the Northwoods document, read how utterly ridiculous that sounds, and realize they wouldn't have written that if they didn't think they could get away with it. If they didn't think they could paint up F-16s to look like Cuban MiGs and have them harass airplanes to create the illusion that this was done by Cuba, they wouldn't have put it forward. They didn't think they could get away with selling the incident. You know, they even went through, okay, well, we're going to have the Mayday signal transmit so that people in the area, wherever it was that they were going to shoot it down, would report it to the United States that it happened. So we could be like surprised, oh my God, I can't believe this happened. Cuba just attacked a civilian airliner and killed a bunch of students on vacation. So they could get the full propaganda effect of all of it. So as long as, as far as 9/11 is concerned, I don't touch on it because really all I'm really trying to do is provide insight into things that are very easily proven. And the vast majority of the entire book is based on what Quigley himself acknowledges and exposes. But as far as 9/11 is concerned, if anybody still believes that that was just an operation that, in my view, my summary of it was a multi-intelligence, multi-state operation. And if you don't think that 9/11 involved multiple intelligence agencies and multiple states that were to facilitate it and benefit from it, then you got to start doing your research. You got to start by reading Quigley or Tragedy and Hope 101 to get a start and really start to understand how these things work, because the other argument up to and including, like the destruction of WTC-7 is it's so ridiculous that it's laughable if you have more insight into how these people function and how that whole thing was used and how the Patriot Act was already written and then trotted out immediately after it, and just everything, how they used it to go into Iraq, which again, I was talking about that. The PNAC document, which is specifically talking about establishing full spectrum dominance, and that there need to be over in that region of the world, but it's the process of transformation is going to be difficult. This is again a paraphrase. The process of transformation, meaning the process of us being able to do what we want and project our power the way we want, is going to be difficult absent a catalyzing and cataclysmic event like a new Pearl Harbor. All right. So now, regardless of how much of an apologist you might be, and regardless of how twisted your mind might be about what the true intentions of the people who determine our policy are, you have to stop and think how coincidental it is that they were writing all of this just prior. In 2000, they were writing this. And then here come the attacks, and here come the press releases where they're calling it our Pearl Harbor. And they used it specifically to do what they had already set out to do, to fulfill their already established military objectives, which they couldn't do without it. They admitted they couldn't do it without it. And then look at what they've done to our freedoms in this country. Something else that they wanted to erode. How could they have possibly made so much progress with spying and even legitimizing torture and foreign intervention and the massive expansion of the surveillance state and everything else? How could they have accomplished all that without 9/11? Are you kidding me? If they weren't behind it, then they needed to be, because according to how they operate, that's what they would want.
Somebody else would have had to steal their business plan.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, because otherwise this is what provides the pretext for all of that. So I don't get into the book. I have my own, I pretty much just stated my opinion on it very succinctly: multi-state, multi-intelligence service operation, and the idea of it just being 19 Arab hijackers commanded by a man in a cave, I think is crazy. And all of the evidence that they've suppressed that demonstrates irrefutably that it's crazy is just, well, I guess it's just par for the course.
Well, and I think that the 19 alleged hijackers aren't separate from the system of multi-state international intelligence agencies to begin with. They're part of the proxy force. I mean, Al Qaeda was just a database list of people who had worked for them under the title of Mujahideen during the Holy War. But then later they're in the Sudan with Osama bin Laden building roads. So he had a construction crew. He's just, he was a gangster, a warlord kind of gangster. And we take that as something other than a politician or a lobbyist group, or, we have these different titles for people in other countries who do very similar actions in this country. There's plenty. Blackwater wouldn't be that much different than Osama bin Laden, and what was the guy's name? I don't forget his name. But
I know it, and it flew out of my head too.
These types of mercenary groups. I mean, how is that different than what Osama bin Laden was doing? And I think when you go back to like the history, because you don't have to comment on 9/11 in your book, because if people understood the nature of the Anglophile and Anglo-American network and their goals, you would see that September 11th, 1973, what happened in Chile that the CIA and Kissinger were involved with, they got away with that. And so when Kissinger's recommended as the guy who's in charge of the 9/11 Commission, it's like, okay, that's because he's gotten away with this sort of stuff before. It's not outside his purview. They don't have to brief him. He's been involved in it all along. Those are the types of guys they have to come in and put the lid on it. And Zelikow is only one more step abstracted from that same group of people. I mean, he had worked for the whole Bush 1 administration and been groomed by these people. So when you have the people committing the atrocities involved of investigating the atrocities, that's certainly not democracy, nor is it a constitutional republic.
It's straight out of the playbook, Richard. I mean, that's the thing. So again, if we can point people to the playbook of the things, because I'm not trying to convince anybody of anything other than what is irrefutably established. We don't need 9/11 because you can ignore it completely and just understand that there is this small group of individuals, unelected, unaccountable, that are controlling policy, and they have a direct aim, and that aim is absolutely contrary to our interests. And here are the instruments that they have created to help them do it. And this is where it's leading, So I'm not saying 9/11 isn't important. I'm just saying, and I'm also, I want to, kind of shore up the concept here. Once you read their playbook and all of the things, one of the biggest things about 9/11 that most people who have no idea how the system actually operates have a problem with is the idea that their government would do that, okay? So that is the real point of making them understand, look, these people are not your government. They are not there to serve you. They don't care about your interests. They don't care about your rights. They don't care about any of the things that you were taught in school. Okay, so if you can get your mind around that, now you can start looking into things that they've done which can be proven, and you will establish in your mind that what I just said is true. Then that provides the intellectual framework for you to look at the evidence about 9/11 in a more objective way, if you want to go there. Because it was the most powerful. It was the most powerful acceleration of everything that we've seen in our life. Obviously, acceleration of their plans. Can you hear me?
Yeah, you broke up just a little bit, but it was I can understand what you were saying. Okay. And you're back on sync now with the Skype and the audio, so that's all good. Just as far as helping people to understand the value in the book. You've got it on tragedyandhope.info. People can get the book there. And what else is on that site? Anything as far as the background?
Yeah, well, okay, so here's the deal. I want everybody to have access to it so they can get the book for free. The entire book is posted at tragedyandhope.info for free. It's not just a teaser or whatever. You can read it. All the footnotes are there. And then in addition to that, you have the, I've provided a bonus material section, which is like the extended notes that I have from, say, Tragedy and Hope. So if you don't really want to read all of Tragedy and Hope, I typed out, 50,000 plus words of what I had highlighted in Tragedy and Hope while I was reading it. Okay, so that would give you the very, very reduced, condensed, word for word resource to find out kind of some of the other stuff that he covers in the book. And then I do it with Operation Gladio. Daniel Ganzer's book is there. There's a few others in there. If you're interested in eugenics, I covered Richard Lynn's Eugenics, a Reassessment. I think that's a really important book if people want to understand, again, the mindset You got to understand the mindset of people who want to torture animals. They enjoy it. That's why they do it. Okay. You have to understand the mindset of people who seek and secure power, the ability to dominate other people. Once you start to understand that, and you hear them saying themselves, like for instance, Realpolitik, Kissinger, a practicer of Realpolitik, and others, they essentially say there is no moral dimension. That is their mantra. Their mantra is, look, we can't be held up by moral things. Our primary objective here is that we have got to be the dominant force. So once you start to think about things in those terms, it becomes a lot easier for you to absorb all these things. Life becomes a little bit more disturbing because you realize what we're living under. But then I think that's what we have to do. More people have to realize that the representative government that they think they live under is just a carefully managed con game. It isn't real.
And I don't think it's permanent, but it's permanent until we learn how to evolve out of that. That's what I call growing in the right direction. Yes, it sucks that we find ourselves in the midst of a reality that we were lied about, but knowing that means we can learn our way forward, actually communicate to each other about what we found along the way. It's like the whole time you're talking about the people who would torture animals or children. What about the guy who developed Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center is a very like well-known, or if not notorious, cancer center. It's prestigious in New York City. It was developed, the guy who was the head of the Army's Chemical Warfare Division, Cornelius Rhodes, who was a proponent of vivisection, which I believe is dissecting a live being or animal while it's conscious and alive. Right. So these are people who wanted to get into torture, developed chemical weapons. And then, he's on the board of like the Atomic Energy Association or whatever the nascent atomic energy group was back then. And now he's in charge, or not now, but then he became in charge of Memorial Sloan Kettering's cancer program, using nuclear medicine to fight cancer and all these sorts of things. So what people think of is, oh, this is a cancer center so they can cure cancer. No, that's not necessarily their objective. Sometimes they want to observe people while they're sick. I mean, Cornelius Rhodes had done studies that were just like, everyone recognizes that they were racist studies, conducting experiments on Puerto Ricans. And then that guy, he's funded by the Rockefeller Foundation and Rockefeller University. And that's what brings, the cancer culture to America. The establishment foundation, run for the cure type of stuff. I just interviewed Rick Simpson a couple days ago. And so in going through and putting the final touches on that, it becomes evident that the same people that are messing with our education or messing with how doctors and healthcare work are the same people that have globalism as an agenda. They're the same people who are promoting eugenics and created nuclear weapons in the first place to use on other human beings. So we're talking about full spectrum dominance by a small group of people who are, antithetical in their goals as far as in juxtaposed to ours.
Right. They don't. Again, it's one of those things. This is the most frustrating part of all of it for me. Is words do not do justice. You can't quite impart the gravity of the mindset of these people. So, like, if you have, you need. I don't know. Maybe it's something to do with our education system or something where it creates a barrier. So, like, if you're talking about, like, let's say Joseph Goebbels, all right, or you're talking about any Nazi, like some Nazi that did just horrible human experimentation, people can learn that person was a horrible monster. They can imagine the things the torture that they subjected other human beings to, children, and all this horrible stuff. And they can, in their mind, then assign that concept to that person. But for whatever reason, it's hard for them to imagine an organized system that is run by people like that, but does not have that connotation associated with it. Okay, so it's like that's part of the illusion. The illusion is we have got to make ourselves look like the most upstanding, we are here because we want to save lives, because we want people to be healthy, because we care about. Okay, so for instance, like the Plutonium Files, another book that people can look into, where it goes through the instances where the government was experimenting on U.S. citizens, not just blacks, which, okay, like that's any different. People can somehow dismiss this. No, they're giving, upscale white women plutonium to see how it affects their babies. And they're telling them it's a vitamin cocktail. Okay, so then when the baby aborts, they can study it and see how it happened. So you can imagine you're walking into some prestigious hospital and it's all white and it's all sanitary, and here come the good doctors and they're here to help you. No, they're not. They're part of a government funded project where they're going to poison you and kill your child. How like you, especially right now, like obviously you can imagine that. How horrible that is. You're about to have a baby. You're going to go to some place that you think is reputable, but even there, they're able to get their fingers into these highly reputable, established places and conduct experiments on people who are completely unaware of it. Or like they were feeding, they were going into the, okay, so obviously one of the weakest people in the world are handicapped people. So what did they do? They go into a home for retarded children, and they're lacing their oatmeal with radioactive isotopes to study it, because they need guinea pigs or MK Ultra. The list goes on and on. The evidence is just overwhelming of what they are if people will look into it.
Yeah, I think the question is, how much information or evidence do people need to actually get that that's going on? And then once you understand that, work toward the solution. Some people need more convincing than others. And I think the major blind spot they have is that they think these tax-free foundations are charitable and philanthropic, when really they're a cover to change culture and arts and to take over hospitals and to control a lot of different aspects of our society.
Absolutely. I just browsed through foundations, their power and influence again, just because there was a Carnegie statement that I couldn't remember, and I wanted to remember it. And it was essentially that this idea of individualism and laissez-faire and all that other stuff is just it's played out. We're not doing that anymore. Okay, the time of the individual is done. This is, well, not really though, because they're going to be the individuals who control everything. All right, so this is not something somebody would think would come from Carnegie, or the Carnegie Institution. They think that, no, this is about kumbaya. We all join hands. It's one big world. We love each other. No, it isn't that anymore. And it never was. Okay. I guess that's really the key point. It never was that. It was presented that way, but it was always about securing and acquiring more control. And we go all the way back, full circle. You're a group of individuals. You want to control all habitable portions of the world. You want to control all the elements of human behavior. That it's not just basic social engineering, okay, which obviously is a huge part of it through the education system and everything else, but this goes all the way down to the biological level that they want to control human behavior. They want to control what you think. They want to control what you believe. They want to control how you behave. They want to control it all. They want to know it all. They want to control it all. And it isn't for your own good. It's for their power. It's for their stated objective. So maybe at some point when enough people start to understand that, then the solutions will come more quickly, because you'll have more people realizing there's a problem and it needs to be solved.
Well, you're right, dude. You're right. And I think a good first step in the right direction is to read Tragedy and Hope 101. I mean, the great first step was you writing it, but other people can now read it. They can read it on tragedyandhope.info. And if you want to support Joe, buy that extra bonus pack to get the additional research that really unlocks it. You get a summary of Tragedy and Hope, the big 1,300-page book. So again, before you go buy...
They don't have to buy that either, my friend. It's all free.
Oh, it's all free?
Yes, it's all free. There's nothing. If they want to buy a hard copy of the book, that's a great idea, because I like the idea of not being something that can be digitally erased.
Right.
All right. But no, it's all there. I mean, they can go through all of the additional. There's probably an extra. Well, let me think. The bonus material is probably another 600 pages or so, if you feel like reading it. And then, of course, there's the list of books that
right,
that have their recommended reading that you can dig more into. But hopefully, if you take the the few hours it'll take you to get through this, you'll get a real good, if you don't already have one, or even if you do and you just kind of want some refreshers and a way to condense it and reframe everything, I think hopefully it'll be useful to just about anybody.
And is it better for folks to get your book on Amazon or from tragedyandhope.info?
The Amazon is easiest.
Okay.
They can just buy through Amazon. That's easiest. Or they can get it, it's available in Kindle on Amazon and hard copy on Amazon, but it's Smashwords and all of the places that they distribute to. They can get it through iTunes, whatever, the iBook, I guess is what it is. It's available in all the different formats, however they want to get it.
Well, that's good. You took away everyone's excuses for why they don't want to read it. It's like, oh, no, it's in the format, it's in the Kindle, it's in the audio, whatever you need. And it's free. And it's free.
So, yeah,
well,
no barriers.
Good job taking the obstacles out of everyone's way and making a clear path so they can get to some meaningful knowledge. Do you have another book project on the table?
Not right now. Not right now. I'm trying to. I spent a lot of money and a lot of time on all this over the past decade, and so I pretty much exhausted all my resources. So I got to start thinking along the lines of actually doing work that is paid again. Sure. So I'm kind of on that, but I'm absolutely certain about 5 years I should be able to get back on my feet again, back where I need to be, so I can finance the next 20 years of doing this.
Yeah. Well, what I can say is the work you did to put this book together is work that was time well spent, and it's work that's going to last the test of time. It's going to be, 20, 30 years from now, this is just going to be as valuable or more valuable than it is now. Hopefully then it'll be people, oh, what happened before everything became free? What was going on back then? And they can use it as a guidebook, and they're not using it as a guidebook to avoid this globalism empire type idea they got, that they're trying to put on everybody on the planet. I mean, there's 7 billion people that they're trying to control. You would think that, a few of us should be interested in preserving the freedom while it exists.
We have to, and hopefully, again, the emerging technologies, these decentralized technologies in banking, in media, obviously, look what the internet has done, how powerful that has been. So, like, let's say, some of the decentralized or distributed technologies in banking, in media, in energy, in manufacturing, all of these things, even in government, who knows how the blockchain might be integrated into controlling these creatures so that people like Kissinger and Dulles can't rise to prominence and do the kind of things that they want to do. I hold out hope for that the more people we can make aware, the faster all of that stuff will start to happen. I don't believe they're going to succeed. And I think if they do succeed, the system will just commit suicide anyway. So that's no real consolation. It's no real consolation, but at least, I think they're up against forces that they'll never understand and can't control. I'm not talking about religion or anything like that. I'm just talking about the inherent nature of the way things work. If you just create this highly concentrated predatory system, it'll just feed on itself until it destructs. It can't do anything else. But we're going to try to get in the way of that if possible.
So you're saying their whole system is set up for self-destruction, to collapse under its own weight. And if we don't want to wait that long and go through that tyranny, people can just grasp the content that's in your book and take action.
And if we don't manage to, even if so some people would say, oh, what's the use? Well, because all the work that we do now is going to pave the way from what emerges, even if it got to that point of absolute horrific tyranny or whatever. Like, look at whatever emerged after Hitler. It might not be the perfect example, but just the idea being all the people who did the work prior helped pave the way for what came afterwards. Okay? The people who resist, the people who come up with the arguments against, the people who warned but were ignored, all of that kind of creates an opportunity for something new to emerge. So to the extent we can define how this system operates, how these people use deception, what kind of mindset is drawn to power, and what just their innate nature is. We're repeating ourselves. That's kind of the whole problem when they say history repeats itself if you don't learn it. But each time, I think we get a little bit further. So if you look at whatever freedom was established for us a couple hundred years ago, yeah, we've gone a long way in the wrong way. But that was a huge improvement over what had been established maybe in 1200 with the Magna Carta or whatever, compared to what preceded it, to what preceded it, to what preceded it. So if if that's optimism, I'm sorry, it's probably not the most optimistic thing in the world, but it's at least a realistic view of it, I think.
Yeah, I think it's realistic optimism. In order to progress past, what they had in 1776 wasn't perfect. and it
Right.
wasn't fully developed or mature as far as freedom goes. But we haven't gone beyond that yet. We've regressed from it, and we're not going to improve upon it and optimize the society by making other people do the will of a few people. I think it comes from having freedom as a lifestyle, and not from a top down centralization. Everybody has to do the certain thing to be free, because that's not working, and they're proving that right now. Everyone has to be spied on to be free is not making sense to more and more people, thankfully, because
Yes.
they were believing it. So I know a lot of work went into creating the book. I appreciate you just taking a little bit of time out of your weekend here to elaborate on this tome and why it can be useful to other people who know how to read the English language, because we're all part of history that is still developing, and they have a plan to do something with the world. I think that if we don't like that plan, we owe it to ourselves and other people to vocalize and voice our concerns and explain why in logical, clear terms that point to objective history that other people can relate to. And I think you did a masterful job of that.
Thanks again. And I'll just add to that one statement, or at the very least, even if people don't want to get involved or they don't want to stand up and say anything about it, become aware of what it is, so at the very least you're not a dupe. So at the very least you can't be manipulated and used as a tool in supporting it. So even if you don't want to go, I mean, certainly you don't have to do as much work as you and Lisa have done or anything like that. Just at the very least, get a really solid understanding of what this system is, so you can see the charade for what it is and not be duped by it. I think if just enough people do that, we're gonna do pretty well.
Well, that's why I made the deep end, so you don't have to be a dupe. That's been Joe Plummer, and we'll see you next time.
All right, man. Thanks a lot.
Thanks, Joe. Peace.
Peace.